Hello, we're kicking off a brand new series this week called Popular. And to kick this series off, I have a really, really important question to ask you. Who do you think is the most famous person on earth? Think about that for a moment. Now, I'm sure that we all have different ideas on this answer. They could be all over the place. Some of you might be shouting out names of musicians. Some of you are naming athletes. Some of you are thinking about YouTubers or actors or even hosts of your favorite TV shows. You see, when it comes to something like fame, we all have different ideas of who's in first place. Why? Because each one of us has a different idea of what's important. You see, if you're not that into sports, an NBA athlete isn't going to be that big of a deal to you. If you don't know much about fashion, you definitely don't know who the best designers are. And if you don't watch the Avengers movies, you don't really care that much about the guy who plays Iron Man. All these things may be popular, but they just aren't popular with you. And because of that, they don't have a lot of influence over your life. So what do I mean by that? Well, influence is the ability to have an effect on someone else. It's the ability to affect someone else's behavior, thoughts, or choices. And while we may not all agree on who's popular in our world or culture, I think we can all agree on this. Popular people have influence. They have people's attention. What they say and what they do matters to people around them. And their popularity gives them the ability to lead or influence other people to change things about themselves for better or for worse. One example from my own life, growing up, I loved basketball. I played basketball all the time. And my favorite player was Reggie Miller. And so I modeled my entire game after Reggie Miller. I would run around the court, run off the screens as fast as I could. I even shot the ball just like Reggie Miller with my elbow sticking out. Like everything I did was modeled after Reggie Miller because he was my favorite player. I loved watching him play the game of basketball. So I would do everything just like him. So here's the funny thing about influence. A lot of us may wonder if we have much of it. We think the ability to influence another person is something that only comes with fame or popularity. Two things that most teenagers, and even adults for that matter, don't always feel like we have. Maybe you wonder how much influence you truly have because you aren't quite sure what you have to offer. You don't have it all figured out, so you don't really know how you can lead or influence others. Even if you do have influence, what are you supposed to do with it? What direction are you supposed to be pointing other people? As a teenager, how do you even know how to use whatever influence you may have? Or maybe you see that you have influence, but you struggle with the fear of failure. You're afraid to actually take the steps to do it because you don't want to mess up, get rejected, or make the wrong move. Or maybe the pressure of influence is just too much for you. You see other people around you who have a lot of influence or are stepping up to lead, and honestly, it just looks like a lot of work. Their influence comes with so much pressure and attention, and you don't want to sign up for that. And then there are those of you who haven't really put a lot of thought into this whole influence thing. You see influencers on YouTube and Insta, but it never really occurred to you that you had the power to influence or lead others too. So here's the point of all this. We tend to think of influence as this thing that's really big and unattainable. It's something that we can't seem to reach ourselves. We are quick to recognize the influence that famous or popular or important people seem to have, but somehow we end up missing the potential we have to influence others. So we're going to look at someone who used what they had to affect others, even though they didn't have very much. It's recorded in one of the Gospels, which are the 4 books in the New Testament in the second half of the Bible that tell us about Jesus' life. And what we'll read today was recorded by John, who was one of Jesus' closest followers and students. In fact, when Jesus was on the cross, one of the last things Jesus did was ask John to care for his mother after he died. So we can read these words knowing that they are written by an eyewitness who is trusted by Jesus. Now let me set the scene. When Jesus traveled around in his 3 years of ministry, crowds almost always followed. It could have been because they had heard about Jesus, wanted healing for something, or were just curious. But whatever the reason, Jesus had a lot of influence and people who were always around him. This particular day was no different. We're going to jump into our passage today in John chapter 6, and it starts out like this. After this, Jesus crossed over to the far side of the Sea of Galilee, also known as the Sea of Tiberias. A huge crowd kept following him wherever he went, because they saw his miraculous signs as he healed the sick. Then Jesus climbed a hill, sat down with his disciples around him. It was nearly time for the Jewish Passover celebration. Jesus soon saw a huge crowd of people coming to look for him. Turning to Philip, he asked, "Where can we buy bread to feed all these people?" He was testing Philip, for he already knew what he was going to do. So imagine the scene for a moment. This large crowd has gathered to see the great miracle worker, Jesus. And what does Jesus do? He asks one of his disciples, Philip, "What should we do?" If I were Philip, I would be like, "Jesus, aren't you the miracle guy? I think this is your area of expertise." But instead, Philip responds this way. Philip replied, "Even if we worked for months, we wouldn't have enough money to feed them." In other words, you got to be kidding me, Jesus. If we're going to feed everyone, there better be someone with a lot of cash around to make that happen, which is a really good point. Because, can you imagine sending someone to McDonald's to order 5,000 Big Mac combos? Super crazy, right? The story continues. Then Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "There's a young boy here with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good is that with this huge crowd?" So apparently, one mom in the entire village packed a lunch for her son, and Andrew thought that was worth pointing out. Because, it was at least something. And that's when Jesus went to work. "Tell everyone to sit down," Jesus said. So they all sat down on the grassy slopes. The men alone numbered about 5,000. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks to God, and distributed them to the people. Afterward, he did the same with the fish. And they all ate as much as they wanted. And everyone was full. Jesus told his disciples, "Now gather the leftovers so that nothing is wasted." So they picked up the pieces and filled 12 baskets with scraps left by the people who had eaten from the 5 barley loaves. And when people saw him do this miraculous sign, they exclaimed, "Surely he is the prophet we have been expecting." Now, there are all kinds of questions that come up whenever I read this story. Was it buffet style? Where did the baskets come from? How exactly did he turn 5 loaves and 2 fish into enough food to feed everyone? But here's maybe the most important question we could ask. Who had the biggest impact in this passage? It's easy to see that Jesus had influence, and lots of it. By the end of this account, a large crowd was calling him a prophet because of the miracle he had performed. And then there's the disciples. They were impactful just by associating with Jesus. But the real superstar of the story may not be who you think. It's the boy with the lunch. Now, at first, it seems like the opposite. How could a kid with some bread and fish be influential? But the truth is, it It wasn't the amount of what he had that allowed him to make a difference. It was his willingness to use what he had that made him influential. And this would have been an even bigger deal in the context Jesus was living in, where children weren't valued at all. No one would have seen this boy as having influence, but that didn't stop him from stepping up. And it was his willingness to do that that ended up impacting thousands of people. Can you imagine how the conversation went with his mom when he got home that afternoon? There were thousands of people there, and they picked my lunch. No one, not even his mom, could have imagined things going that way. But they did. And thousands of years later, we're still telling his story. I bet this kid and everyone around this kid never thought influence like this would be part of his story. It didn't matter that he didn't take the stage, or that he wasn't well known or in a position of leadership, or that he wasn't a speaker or a preacher, or that he wasn't super athletic or popular or academic. He wasn't even cool or interesting enough that the writer would tell us his name. Those things were not important because Jesus wasn't looking for any of that. The only thing that mattered was that this boy brought all that he had and that it was enough, because ultimately this was about the power of Jesus and what Jesus was capable of doing through someone who was willing to be used to offer what he had. As you just learned, you don't have to be popular or well-known or famous to have influence. You don't need to have the most followers on Instagram or the most views on TikTok to get it. You don't have to sit with the most people at lunch or be the one everybody wants to sit next to on the bus. You simply have to be willing to let Jesus use what you have. You have to be willing to give whatever you've got for the good of others. If you come to the table with that, I promise Jesus will use your influence to impact the people around you in the best ways. Because Jesus can use whatever you have to do big things. And today I simply want to help you start seeing that. Maybe the best thing you can do today is begin to recognize the influence you have. And maybe it's influence with your family or your teammates or in your friend group or your youth group at church or even your entire class at school. Or maybe it's just one close friend or one kid in your small group or one younger sibling or one student on the bus you talk to every morning. Either way, it's influence. And you have it. It doesn't have to be thousands of people. It doesn't even have to be dozens. If there's one person in your life who you can lead towards something positive, that is influence. And if you're not sure, ask someone you trust to help you see it. A close friend, a parent, a church leader. Ask them where they see you might have more potential to influence others than you realize. And then be willing to do something with what you have to offer. Maybe you have time to give to your younger siblings, or a seat at the lunch table to offer a friend, or a weekend to spend with your youth group. Maybe you have a kind word to share with a teammate, or a sense of humor to make your mom laugh, or an invitation to church for someone who needs it. Think about it. We all have something to offer others. And when we're willing to use what we have, that's influence. If you're not sure what you have to give, again, asking someone close to you for an idea is a great place to start. Because whether you realize it or not, you definitely have something. Now let's flip that. Before we head out, I want you to think about a person in your life who has affected you in a positive way. What was it about them that allowed them to have an impact on you? How did their influence impact your life for the good? In the same way that others have had an effect on you, you have the same ability to have an effect on others. That's why we have youth group and small groups, because the people that you have around you have an effect on you, and you have an effect on them. Maybe more than you think. The question to ask yourself isn't, do I have the ability to impact others? Instead, the question should be, how will I use the influence that I have? How will I use the influence that I already have? Ultimately, God is the one who has the power to change people. All you have to do is show up, offer what you have, and let Him do the rest. So this week, think about this question as well. What's one area I have influence in? Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you again next week.